violin is right where I left it, which is really good to know. Love when that happens. Please be seated while I figure out how my tablet works. Okay. Hi, welcome to my lecture recital. My name is Catherine, if you haven't met me before, and if you haven't met me before, why are you here? There's no program today, and that's because it seemed wrong to write a program with only one work listed on it. It just felt strange, and no program notes because I am the program notes today. So I will introduce today's program. There it is, and you'll see it again at the end once we're performing. You'll hear a lecture about Dmitri Shostakovich's Quartet number 12, which has only two movements, air quotes, more on this later, followed by a brief 10-minute intermission so that I can warm up. And then we will perform the piece for you. So by we, I mean my quartet. I'm Catherine, the first violinist, but we also have Joyce, Bennett, and Mahtab in the quartet with me. You are welcome to ask me questions after the concert. Please ask questions. I love talking about my research. That's why I'm doing this talk. I'll address the first question on everybody's mind right now, which is why the Quartet 12 and why a Russian composer's relatively modern quartet right now. And I will say, I'm not going to touch today's current events. There's more news every day. I can't keep up with all of it. But I will say I can't completely ignore what's happening. So just before we get started, I want to say that I don't believe the Quartet number 12 has anything to do with politics or world events. And I do plan to argue that point. And I also admit that I arrived at Quartet number 12 entirely by accident. So that's also a factor. So I fell in love with Shostakovich quartets a long time ago, and this love has continued through all of my university exploits so far. In my last year of undergrad, I performed his Quartet number 9, and the performance was successful. But at the time, I was going through a lot of just personal struggles, some personal emergencies. So I always wished that I could have dedicated more time to that concert. So even though it was successful, I just wanted to do it better. So when I went into my master's, I chose to perform Quartet number 6 in my graduation recital, which I believe the Lafayettes accidentally witnessed when I played for them in a masterclass. So once again, my performance was actually successful, but at the time, I came down with pneumonia before my graduation recital. So even though it was successful, I really wanted to do it better. So I always wished that I had the health and the energy to give it the energy that it deserved. So when I began my work for this Master's in Musicology, I started with that very same quartet. My goal was to compare it, the Quartet number 6, to a later contrasting quartet. And I started off by comparing it with number 12, because 6 is halfway to 12. That's what I thought. Otherwise, I'm kind of embarrassed to say that there was no math involved in this decision except for this math. It was simply my starting point for what I thought was going to become a wider focus of research, and instead my focus became much, much, much narrower. Oops. Since I knew plenty already about Quartet number 6, I started my research with Quartet number 12. And immediately I had two minds. One of my minds was musicological, so I was exploring the study and the construction of the quartet. The other mind was performance-based, interested in the history of the work's creation and presentation. I therefore expected to find scholarship on its unusual formal construction and a little bit on Shostakovich's quartet reception history among audiences at the time, but the first discovery that I made was actually an article describing the world premiere performance of Quartet number 12 in a smaller hall, which was the Queen Elizabeth Playhouse, which, if you don't know it, is in downtown Vancouver, which really surprised me. This Canadian history, which is unique to Quartet number 12, captured my attention immediately, and I hope that it also captures yours. So today, I wish to walk through the history of this quartet and its original performers. I argue that the quartet genre as a whole is a social medium, and that we should extend this understanding to Shostakovich's cycle of quartets. Each of his quartets can be thought of as a portrait of a person or people, including private references that are both for and about the people it's dedicated to. In the case of 12, its Canadian history should also inform its performance. I hope to play the work with respect to everyone who's been involved with it. Shostakovich, the Borodin Quartet who premiered it, and the violinist Dmitry Tsiganov of the Beethoven Quartet Ensemble, to whom the work was dedicated. To do this, my research encompasses several uncommon materials. I have started my work with the traditional academic sources, historical references, encyclopedias, journal articles, and books. There were not many Canadian academic sources on the reception history of Quartet No. 12, so here I turned to newspapers from the time period and performance location, corresponded with the organizers of that premier concert, and opened the City of Vancouver archives to find supporting materials, all of which I will share with you today, so you will get to see it. As I mentioned earlier, the quartet genre is social. Unlike the mass compromises of the orchestra or the solitary choices of a soloist, a chamber ensemble's decision-making must always involve collaboration. Every detail is a communal agreement, from our bow directions to our intonation. Previous recordings of other performances and lessons from other performers also inform our judgment. Therefore, I believe the best place to start looking at Quartet No. 12 is first by recognizing all of the musicians involved with its performance that I will be talking about today, as well as the composer and his relationship to them. Shostakovich himself was born in 1906 into a relatively musical family. Both parents played piano, and his mother was a graduate of the St. Petersburg Conservatory, which is now called Petrograd. By 1915, when he was around 9 years old, he was already composing simple piano compositions for his music teacher. In 1919, his mother's connections at Petrograd facilitated his entrance into the conservatory, where he studied mainly with Alexander Glazunov and Maximilian Steinberg. Later that year, he completed his definitive Opus 1, the Scherzo for Orchestra. According to David Fanning, during Shostakovich's conservatory years, Steinberg became, this is a quote, vexed by his pupil's interest in Western-inspired grotesquerie. But he still graduated in 1923 with a reputation for his musical talent, perfect pitch, and a gift for memorization. In 1927, Shostakovich became internationally famous after his Symphony No. 1 was premiered in Berlin. He also attended the Chopin piano competition during this year, which apparently left him discouraged with solo performance, and instead solidified his love of chamber music. In 1929, his first opera, The Nose, premieres. The Russian Association of Proletarian Musicians, or the RAPM, was ascending rapidly. It overpowered the Western focus group, the Association for Contemporary Music. For the first time, Shostakovich is accused of the crime of formalism by the RAPM. The association is then replaced by the Union of Soviet Composers, which is generally more tolerant of composers, but also more dangerously controlled by Joseph Stalin's party. In 1930, for his own safety, Shostakovich expresses an apology for his contributions to delinquent genres such as jazz. However, he continues to compose and perform music, such as his first jazz suite. In 1934, he premieres his next opera, The Lady Macbeth. It is somewhat popular and continued to be performed repeatedly. That is until January of 1936, when Stalin himself attends a performance of the opera and dislikes it. Lady Macbeth is immediately condemned in the famous Pravda newspaper denouncement. A time period known as the Great Terror begins. Many of Shostakovich's former colleagues and family members speak out against him. His supporters are arrested, and several of his friends are executed on Stalin's command. His wife, Nina Vartsar, is 6 months pregnant. His daughter and first child, Galina, is born in May of that year. Desperate to support his family during a time where it is dangerous to compose, Shostakovich instead began teaching music at the Leningrad Conservatory, where he wrote smaller, more private works in contrast to his previous orchestral scores and operas. String Quartet No. 1 is completed there at the Conservatory in 1938. The peace does not last. Shostakovich stops teaching in 1941 due to the German invasion of Russia and the siege of Leningrad, which is now known as St. Petersburg. Shostakovich fled to Moscow, where he once again began teaching at the Moscow Conservatory. Here he met four friends, violinist Rostislav Tubinsky and Vladimir Rabe, violist Rudolf Borchardt, and cellist Valentin Berlinsky. In 1943, those four musicians formed the first quartet of students of Moscow Conservatory, which will later become the Borodin Quartet. String quartets 2 and 3 are completed here. Shostakovich rejoined the Leningrad Conservatory, but in 1948, a second denouncement at the Composers' Conference once again accuses him of formalism, and Shostakovich lost both teaching positions in Leningrad and Moscow. String quartets 4 and 5 are composed but not performed due to Shostakovich's formalist reputation. Stalin passes in 1953. His death provides Shostakovich some safety and affords for chamber ensembles to travel beyond the Iron Curtain with permission from the government. The Moscow Quartet successfully applies to the state to change their name and travel. They become known as the Borodin Quartet, and they are the first Russian quartet authorized to perform outside of Russia. Meanwhile, the quartets number 4 and 5 are premiered by another group of Shostakovich's companions, the Beethoven Quartet Ensemble. The Beethoven Quartet will continue to premiere almost all his string quartets, while the Borodin Quartet shares all of them abroad. From here, the quartets are composed relatively quickly, with at least one composed every few years. The final quartet number 15 is composed in 1974. Shostakovich passes away in Moscow on August 9, 1975. The overview of Shostakovich's life perhaps explains the tendency some authors had, and still have today, with associating his political thoughts and alliances with all of his music indiscriminately. Neil McLaughlin's 1974 article on Shostakovich's string quartets in the Musical Times claims that number 1 was written as a reaction to the forced withdrawal of Symphony No. 4 after the Pravda denouncement and the subsequent politically charged presentation of Symphony No. 5. Quartet number 1 is boiled down to an isolated diversion. He writes this article during Shostakovich's lifetime and is eagerly anticipating the release of Quartet number 14. Patrick McCrellis later states that all of Shostakovich's large works, such as the symphonies, are meant to highlight unspeakable truths about the world, and then quotes Shostakovich as saying Quartet number 12 is a symphony, a symphony. His own interpretation of Quartet number 12 is that it is a reaction as a Soviet composer to musical modernism in the West, inspired by a year of turbulence in the Soviet Union, the United States, and Western Europe. Musicologists following Shostakovich's reception history at the time also report similar feelings expressed to the general public in program notes and newspaper articles abroad. Terry Waite Lefstad's dissertation on American audience reception explains that the works that reached the widest American audiences were presented to the American general public as works with a pro-Soviet message. Lefstad's sources draw almost exclusively from American reviews from popular periodicals and newspapers. He ultimately concludes that Shostakovich's music was received in America as music for the masses composed according to government policy. We can see evidence of this trend continuing into the modern day for ourselves. Here, for example, is Anthony Tomasini's article on Shostakovich string quartets. String quartets reveal the private Shostakovich, in which he describes how the quartets are written in reaction to the Soviet atmosphere in defiance of the state. This article was published in 2006 for the New York Times audience. My point here is that although trained critics, musicologists, and performers may have known better when the quartets were premiered, General audiences probably would not, given all of the material that they have to read. It would be wrong to make the blanket statement that all 15 Shostakovich quartets are purely expressing his intimate personal thoughts, with no relation to the political climate in which he lived. However, in my personal performance practice, I prefer to present the quartets on stage as musical portraits. As you can see, don't worry, this will get a little bit smaller in a second. I'll make it easier to read, I promise. But as you can see, almost every single quartet score bears an explicit dedication to a specific group of people or person. Now, let me make this a little bigger for you. There you go. The only potential exceptions to this rule are quartets 6 and 15, and each of those quartets has an excuse. Quartet number 6 was presented to his wife, Margarita Kayanova, as a gift during their honeymoon, so it can still be associated with her. That quartet begins with the viola repeating the note D, 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 D. That's how it goes. Is that good singing? I'll be here all day. DD is also his first initials, Dmitri Dmitrievich Shostakovich, and each of the 4 movements ends with a chord representing one letter of his signature, D, S, C, and H. So it is a gift, and it's signed, just like a card. Quartet number 15, meanwhile, being composed while Shostakovich was sketching out the structure of the next potential quartet, number 16. But with his health failing, he instead dedicated all of his energy towards finishing quartet number 15. Shostakovich realized this would be his last quartet, so the dedication that it bears, Meditations on Death, is about himself, a requiem of sorts. Quartet number 8 is also an outlier in that it's dedicated to a large group of people, the victims of fascism and war. But Shostakovich himself is one of those victims. In a letter to his close friend, Isaac Lichtman, Shostakovich expressed that, "I started thinking that if someday I die, nobody is likely to write a work in memory of me." And to his daughter Galina, he simply said that, "I dedicated it to myself." So you see, each quartet is associated with a person, whether it is a companion, a lover, or the composer himself. Out of the 15 dedications, no less than 6 of the quartets were sworn to members of the Beethoven Quartet. Quartet number 12 is dedicated to Dmitri Tsiganov, the first violinist in the Beethoven ensemble, who had worked closely with Shostakovich to premiere all of his quartets. Also shared across all 15 quartets is a loosely guided series of key signatures. Inspired by Bach's well-tempered clavier, Shostakovich planned to write 24 quartets, each in a different, unique key. In general, the quartets descend in minor thirds. Quartet 7, however, breaks the cycle, written in F-sharp minor, rather than the planned E-flat major. Quartet 9 corrects this deviation, filling in the missing E-flat quartet, and then the cycle of descending thirds continues as planned. Stephen Harris proposes 2 theories on his popular website. One is that quartets 7 and 9 were both unambiguously dedicated to Shostakovich's wives, and perhaps they were worthy of deviation. The second theory is that Shostakovich enjoyed playing with numbers, and upsetting the pattern in this way would mean the 4 quartets representing the letters D, S, C, and H, which aligns with D major, E flat major, C major, and B major, would all fall on quartet numbers that could be squared. Quartets 4, 9, 1, and the missing 16. And the sketches of quartet number 16 confirm it would have been in the planned B major key. Whether you believe the theories or not, at the very least, I hope it's clear that when it came to the quartets, Shostakovich enjoyed meticulous planning over long periods of time, and though he occasionally breaks his own self-made rules, he never strays far from his initial intentions. With that said, what was the plan for quartet number 12? Well, most of the ideas that make up quartet number 12. are encapsulated immediately in the first two measures, which sound like this. Thank you, Matab. Appreciate you. When the Borodin Quartet brought the work abroad on his first tour in 1969, every subsequent review focused on this tone row, though not necessarily of any understanding of what it meant, as the score was not yet available until 1970. It wasn't even published, so nobody could check. The predominant theory for why Shostakovich uses tone rows at all in this quartet is kind of a simple one, and its belief is encouraged by musicologists and performers alike, among minds such as Stephen Brown, Patrick McCrellis, and the Lafayette Quartet. They've mentioned it. Multiple sources have affirmed to me that the purpose of the 12 tone rows is a modest joke referring to the title of the quartet being number 12. Exciting. Regardless, the tone row still has a meaningful impact on how the rest of the quartet unfolds, and it certainly upholds Shostakovich's reputation for fastidious planning. I have already suggested that the quartet as a whole is a portrait of Dmitri Tsiganov, to whom it is dedicated, and the tone row and the following violin entrance is the first stroke of the paintbrush. Allow me to paint the rest of the picture, and the tone row will make more sense. Tsiganov was the proud first violinist of the Beethoven Quartet Ensemble, but he was facing a shift in the proverbial wind. In 1964, the violist Borisovsky retired from the quartet due to his ill health affecting his performance. In 1965, the second violinist Vasily Shirinsky unfortunately passed away. Tsiganov himself refused to retire from the quartet until 1977, a full 9 years after the composing of quartet number 12, and over a decade after Borisovsky's exit. At the time of the work's writing, however, the only remaining original members of the quartet were Tsiganov and the cellist Sergei Shirinsky. And yes, Sergei and Vasily are half-brothers, they are related. The opening two measures begin the work with the two remaining members of the Beethoven Quartet, who were also longtime friends of the composer. It can be thought of as a reflection on personal relationships between musicians. Some small amounts of arithmetic can also be applied to the tone row in order to gauge its emotional impact in a way that's tangible. We can see and hear 3 perfect rising fourths, and I've highlighted them in orange, 3 perfect fourths. And please don't be alarmed by this advanced math calculation, but 4 times 3 equals 12. I did it. The number 12 also includes the numbers 1 and 2, shocking, represented by tones and semitones, which can create a clash of major and minor intervals. So, while the cello continues its pattern of perfect fourths rising in whole steps, which you can see through measures 2 through 5, in orange you can see the fourths, before the viola takes over, the violin dramatically draws out a semitone in green, followed by a fourth, then a whole tone in blue. I hope you can see it. Yeah. The triple fourths and the half-step, whole-step tension is established immediately, and these ideas are repeated until the very last chord in the work. Intellectually, the numbers and intervals create a foundation for dissonance and tension. Meanwhile, the cadential resolution into D-flat and above it the dominant A-flat demonstrates a longing for traditional 4-note chord harmony, despite the atonal opening measure. Now, forgive me for saying so, but performance is not always an intellectual or academic practice. While it's true that great knowledge is required for stellar performance, the art of the violin, viola, or cello is also an incredibly physical labor. Musicologists have done their best to frame the tone rows in theoretical terms, The tone rows were described by Stephen Brown as having two zones of activity, what he calls the C major hexachordal diatonic zone and the G flat / F sharp major hexachordal diatonic zone. But in layman's terms, this could be thought of as just the C major zone and the everywhere else zone on the piano. They don't quite correspond to all white keys and all black keys, which is all right, because the work is not written for piano. On a stringed instrument, they could better be described as the comfortable hand position zone and the awkward hand position zone. Please watch the opening tone row played again, very slowly but transposed by me, and notice how much movement is required in the left hand. I'm going to need my violin. Why did I put it all the way over here? I don't know. Really hard to do when I don't have a cello. But can you see this? Yay! It works! Yay! I don't need this anymore. You stay there. Be good. Okay, that was really stressful. Thank you for clapping. So I hope you can hear it audibly, but also see it visually. And I hope you also know that I'm not a cellist, and when you play it on a cello, those jumps are bigger because the cello is much bigger. So when we play it all together, you will be able to see it as well as hear it. The tone row creates discomfort, both emotionally and physically, through its use of carefully placed intervals. It continues to do so throughout the rest of the quartet every time a tone row appears. Each time it resolves into an appropriate cadence, which makes harmonic sense in the tonality of D flat major, except for when it's used as dissonant tone clusters. And in some parts of the second movement, the 12 tones arrive all at once. It looks like this, and it also sounds like this. That's really cool. I think it's really cool. That's why I picked this piece. Meanwhile, another instrument, either the violin or the cello, will always fight back against these tone clusters. There is one more reference to the Beethoven quartet that is immediately apparent to the performers, but not always noticed by the audience, and that's what is not heard, an aspect that was not mentioned in any of the early reviews. That is, I don't know if you can see it. Can you see what's missing in this score? Yeah. 2, yes, the lack of a second violinist. So as I mentioned, the second violinist, Sherinsky, had just recently passed away. The entirety of quartet number 11, the previous quartet, was dedicated to his memory. While quartet 12 I interpret as about Tsiganov, it's also about Tsiganov's relationships with the members of his quartet. The second violinist does not enter until measure 34. While there is no definitive explanation for this from Shostakovich himself, there is a popular theory echoed in many program notes and articles that has established a tradition among performers, which I will not ignore. Vasily Sherinsky performed with the Beethoven Quartet for 34 years. The 34 measures is the measure of his loss. It is, literally, the absence of his contribution to the quartet's harmony. I cannot hear or feel the tone rows and the opening trio as anything other than an uncomfortable trial. Tsiganov's longing for the 4-note harmonies of the full Beethoven Quartet ensemble and his long relationship with its performers. This quartet also contains many references to Beethoven's Quartet Opus 59 No. 1, also known as the Razumovsky Quartet, which looks like this. This is not the Beethoven Quartet, the ensemble, but a quartet by Ludwig van Beethoven. I hope that's clear. So it looks like this. Do you notice any similarities to the Shostakovich? Just all by yourselves. Count Razumovsky himself was a Russian ambassador and supporter of the arts, and one of Beethoven's first patrons. Razumovsky's remaining library collection of art and sheet music is currently held in Kiev, Ukraine. Beethoven's Opus 59, which contains 3 string quartets, is dedicated to Razumovsky and includes Russian folk songs and stylistic choices. This is an easy joke by Shostakovich. His own Quartet No. 12 is about the relationship between Siganov and the Beethoven ensemble. Therefore, there are as many references to Beethoven's most Russian quartet as he could fit. You can also see the cello opens the quartet in a somewhat similar manner to the Razumovsky, not quite exactly the same, but somewhat similar. In Shostakovich's score, the following highlighted measures in the cello are a direct quote from this Beethoven quartet, pulled from the coda of the exposition in the first movement, which is right here, so that's the Beethoven. Here it is in measure 94. Many parts of the Shostakovich quartet are visually similar to the Razumovsky, as Shostakovich tactically deploys the very same compositional techniques. Stretto and trills in the scherzo sections, the quartet playing together in block chords, unusual scale patterns in every instrument at once, which look like this. You'll hear them, and you won't know what's going on, but it's just scales. Developmental fugues also happen, and even the overall structure of the work in general. Now we've reached the two-movement issue that I kind of glossed over in the introduction, which is this. Technically, Quartet No. 12 is only 2 movements long, but structurally, if the 2 movements are examined closer, they share a lot in common with the Beethoven-Razumovsky quartet. Shostakovich's first movement is a more traditional compared to the second movement. It has a satisfying opening theme, a contrasting idea that balances that serious melody with a demented waltz, some development of those themes, and then a conclusion which ties both those themes together. The pattern of triple fourths, the divide between half steps and whole steps, and the desire for D-flat tonic harmony are explored right to the last bar. Simply put, like most traditional classical movements, it could be performed as a self-contained musical work, as a moderato-allegretto. And we have done that in the past. We've performed just the first movement as one piece. The second movement is an altogether different beast. Many musicologists agree it audibly sounds like 4 separate movements. Patrick McCrellis points out that formal analyses of the second movement are all controversial to each other, and that there are many different arguments among scholars on how to do it. Hans Keller, in his review of the quartet's British premiere in 1970, uses numerous score examples which were newly published to argue that the second movement is actually based entirely on the formal structure of Schoenberg's Chamber Symphony for some reason. And Stephen Brown analyzes the second movement as a combined second, third, and fourth movement, which reinforces its large-scale Beethovenian trajectory. So none of them agree with each other. For what it's worth, I believe the structure of the second movement belongs to Shostakovich, and that he may have drawn inspiration from Beethoven in adding a scherzo episode, a word which Shostakovich himself used to describe the different parts of the gargantuan second movement in his program notes, which he wrote for that London performance where it got described as Schoenberg. I believe his choice of words implies that the movement is indeed a multifaceted whole, a look into Siganov's different emotions surrounding the loss of his quartet members, and his ultimate reaffirmation of love for his career. Here's my best attempt at summarizing the 4 episodes. Episode 1 consists of an Allegretto scherzo. It begins with what we have been asked to perform as a brutal fire alarm. It occasionally breaks into moments of pure, horrifying madness, in which a soloist, either the violin or viola, is accompanied by a swarm of bees, which is all of those crazy scale patterns that showed up for a second there. It is an outburst of anger and denial. The scherzo episode defines a rhythmic motive, which will appear sporadically in the other episodes, and it is taken directly from a moment in the Razumovsky Quartet. Episode 2 is an Adagio Lament, in which a cello and violin solo are accompanied by the tread of death itself. And that's a quote from what was written in my part, left behind by either the Lafayette Quartet or Dubinsky. Somebody said, play it like the tread of death itself, and it was so important that it got written into my part. And it scared the heck out of me when I first read it, so thank you for that. So cluster chords also appear and also scare the heck out of me. And they express all 12 possible pitch classes beneath the solos. This second episode is actually a clear expression of sadness when you hear it. There are moments that are very scary, but overall, it is incredibly sad. Episode 3 is a surprise recapitulation of the first movement. It begins in E-flat major instead of D-flat, but it quickly corrects itself. Valentin Berlinski, the cellist of the Borodin Quartet, interpreted this melody as a hymn. He found the return of the original opening melody in the wrong key to be the beginning of a terrifying finale. My own interpretation is that this is a simple reframing of whatever thoughts Tsiganov had in the opening measures, and that perhaps his thoughts have drifted off course somewhat, and that he must come to a proper conclusion. Tsiganov's final decision is made in episode 4, the Allegretto grand finale, which merges elements of all the other episodes together. The scherzo rhythms, the cluster chords, the fourths, and the original reaching for D-flat major tonality all conclude with a drawn-out, repetitive, perfect cadence. The Beethoven ensemble will continue triumphantly with Tsiganov. The harmony is resolved. It is a stubborn victory over atonality, at least for now, because there's always a but with Shostakovich's sarcastic music. The reception of Quartet number 12 and its absurdly lengthy second movement have been a worldwide success, evident from the reviews I consulted during my research. However, what I was most concerned with was the reaction here in BC. This was the most interesting aspect of my research, as it literally hit me close to home. So I now turn to the history of a second ensemble, the Borodin Quartet, which, if you'll remember, was the first quartet permitted to travel across the Iron Curtain and perform the Shostakovich quartets abroad. And the picture that you're looking at right now is where they performed it, the Queen Elizabeth. The Borodins at the time were led by first violinist Rostislav Dubinsky, who worked extensively with the Lafayette Quartet and passed down his interpretation of this quartet, and to whom I am incredibly grateful for his insight, though I have never met him. Alongside him were second violinist Yaroslav Alexandrov, violist Dmitry Shivalin, and cellist Valentin Berlinski. I owe much of the reconstruction of this Canadian history to Berlinski, who left behind his detailed diary and notes in his book, A Quartet for Life. The Borodins began touring outside the Soviet Union in 1955. In 1969, they made 2 separate trips to Canada. The first brought them here, to this very performance hall in Victoria. Here, in the advertisement from the Victoria Daily Times, evidently they were eclipsed in the news by the violinist Yossi Ziboni. Let me zoom in for you on the ad. It's right here. Yeah, that was my reaction too. In 1966, the Borodins then began touring the full Shostakovich cycle, which at the time encompassed only 11 quartets, and the rest had not yet been written. In June of 1969, the first scattered articles in local newspapers began to appear for their upcoming performance in Vancouver. The organizers of the concert, the Friends of Chamber Music Festival, worried about the viability of the performance. Would audiences want to hear quintessential Russian chamber music during the height of the Cold War? However, with a generous donation from the Canadian Broadcasting Company, specifically granted for the Borodins, the concert was set. Eric Wilson, then the president of the festival, expressed that he hoped for 60% of the Queen Elizabeth Theatre seats to be filled in time for the performance. Tickets were sold for $3.50 per concert, or $9 to see the entire cycle, in the hopes that the pricing would help to fill the seats. And you can see the prices at the bottom of the ad. It is right underneath the Conqueror worm. I hope that's big enough. So perhaps this anxiety also explains why the newspapers tried to advertise the concerts as simple and accessible. Here, the province tries to soothe the potential audience. I should state that the Shostakovich quartets, unlike those of Bartók and Schoenberg, that's how they spelled it, are not in the least advanced, but rather expressed in a comprehensible sort of language, a language comprehensible because it is firmly rooted in the rememberable past. That is an article from the province. An article in the women's section of the province advises fashionable audience members to attend a reception at the expensive Kerner family house after the concerts. The Vancouver Sun reminds readers that the 4 musicians will be staying for their entire engagement, whatever the audience reaction. Yeah, I laughed too. A full Shostakovich quartet cycle had never been performed in Canada. The festival organizers were nervous. Neil Sutherland, then CBC Vancouver's executive music producer, was helping the festival with the production. An article on his work hints at how planning was limited by the fact that the score for Quartet No. 12 was unpublished and no English articles on it yet existed. On Friday, July 4th, the first concert in the series is performed, covering Shostakovich's Quartets 2, 1, 3, and 7. It is a grand success according to the news. 90% of the seats are sold, and the other 2 concerts immediately sell out ahead of time. By process of elimination, the second concert on July 8th must have included Quartets 4, 5, and 6. The final monster concert blasts through Quartets 10, 8, and Intermission before 9 and 11, and then closed with the advertised number 12. The program notes for 12 are translated from a selection from a Russian article supplied by the Borodins and hastily slipped into the program as a separately printed leaflet. It's kind of visible. It's a teeny tiny type. It's not very big in real life. They had to fit that tiny page into the inside of their already printed program notes. And it's cut out just with scissors. So they did it. Eric Wilson reports that at the end of the 12th quartet, both the audience and the Borodin quartet are visibly emotional. A standing ovation breaks out. The quartet gives a simple and probably exhausted spasibo, meaning thank you. The reviews roll in. The Quartet No. 12 is a triumph of man's reason, and the Borodins are 4 of the world's finest musicians. The Borodin Quartet mail a letter to the Friends of Chamber Music, who relay it to the province newspaper. The Shostakovich cycle in Vancouver was one of the great experiences in our musical life. We found your audiences to be the best in all of America, and we thank you all for listening so attentively. These concerts will be unforgettable for us. Deepest gratitude goes to you and everyone who made this great event possible. With love, the Board and Quartet. The Canadian success of this Board and Quartet cycle cements a legacy in Vancouver and BC. They are repeatedly invited back to the Friends of Chamber Music to celebrate the success of this very concert, reappearing in 2015 for another sold-out 70th anniversary Shostakovich cycle. Their first violinist, Dubinsky, will eventually extend his knowledge of the quartets to the Lafayette Ensemble, who will in turn extend their knowledge to the University of Victoria. All of this history to explain, there has been an unspoken musical tradition in BC, a generational knowledge that began in 1969. It has been virtually unknown to Canadians, except for those present in 1969 at a specific festival concert. In fact, when I showed this Canadian history to the members of the Lafayette Quartet, they expressed surprise. It is my hope that the following performance will be an experience of shared knowledge. A single interpretation distributed evenly between the players and the audience. All of us will consider this quartet a portrait of Dmitri Tsiganov, an exploration of his complex feelings for work with the Beethoven Quartet. Each one of us will value this performance as an addition to a Canadian tradition of knowledge, an extension of those repeated celebrations for the premier performance of this quartet. Finally, I leave you with a quote by Shostakovich himself and a picture of him when he's happy because he's holding a pig. I believe that a large proportion of creative activity cannot be explained. And I do believe that that is correct. So the only way that I can truly explain my interpretation of this is to perform the quartet for you. Thank you very much for attending this concert. And thank you also, because I won't be able to use this microphone afterwards, thank you to my quartet and also to Anne, Joanna, and Joe for teaching me everything about it. I'm going to take a 10-minute intermission to tune and find my quartet, and then I will meet you back on stage. Thank you very much. Thank you.